Welcome to this explainer. I want you to try and picture this with me right now. We are deep in the incredibly dense, stifling rainforests of North Aceh. It's September of 1910. The air is just thick with humidity, the smell of damp earth, and, honestly, the lingering, acrid smoke of a recent firefight. Right in the center of a small, totally exhausted band of fighters stands a woman. But she isn't just surviving the jungle out there. She's about to orchestrate one of the most fierce, relentless resistance campaigns in history. Today, we're exploring the absolutely extraordinary leadership of Cut Nyak Mutea, an unparalleled guerrilla commander.
So you have to ask yourself, what kind of leader actually does that? Think about the situation. Her co-commander, who also happens to be her husband, has just been killed in a really brutal firefight. The elite Dutch counterinsurgency forces are closing in on all sides, and then she's offered a way out, amnesty, a free pass. But instead of surrendering, she steps up, takes supreme command of her remaining fighters, and literally marches them deeper into the unforgiving wilderness just to continue the fight. To really grasp this immense level of resolve, we need to take a step back and understand exactly where she came from.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, Forged in the Aceh War, looking at the 1870s to the 1890s. Cut Mutea grew up in a very patriotic, noble family right during the outbreak of the incredibly brutal Aceh War in 1873. Because of this, her anti-colonial values were completely unyielding. When she reached adulthood, she was actually arranged to marry a man named Tuku Samsarif. Now, he was a guy who favored cooperation and diplomatic compromise with the Dutch colonial authorities. Well, for Cut Mutea, this was entirely unacceptable. It was a deal-breaker, so she divorced him over it. Instead, she chose to marry his brother, Tuku Chikdi Tunong, who was a man completely committed to armed anti-colonial resistance. Basically, she actively chose a partner who matched her own absolute, unwavering dedication to the cause.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Mountain Guerrilla Campaign.
So, knowing full well that they couldn't just fight the heavily armed Dutch military in conventional open-field battles, Cut Mutea and Chikdi Tunong retreated into the really rugged mountains and dense forests of North Aceh. And out there, their unit became a massive, highly active threat in the Pasai and Karato regions. They were executing these lightning-fast hit-and-run attacks on Dutch military outposts. They were actively sabotaging colonial railway infrastructure to completely paralyze troop movements, and they raided supply trains just to arm and feed their own resistance forces. You see, this wasn't just some passive hiding game in the woods. This was calculated, high-stakes tactical warfare, and Cut Mutea was right at the center of the whole shebang.
But we have to acknowledge that the pace of this insurgency was just absolutely brutal. In March of 1905, the Dutch captured and executed her husband, Chikdi Tunong. Now, before facing the firing squad, his dying wish was actually for his trusted lieutenant, Pong Nongro, to marry Cut Mutea and care for their young son, Raja Sabi. Honoring this, she did marry Pong Nongro, and together they kept that fierce insurgency going strong. But then, tragedy struck again. On September 26, 1910, Pong Nongro was killed in an ambush. And that sets the stage for her ultimate test, just a single month later.
Moving on to Section 3, taking supreme command in September 1910.
In late September 1910, at a place called Paya Sichem, the Dutch deployed their elite Corps Marechaussee. They ambushed the guerrillas, and as we just mentioned, killed Peng Nongro. But Cut Mutea actually managed to escape into the rainforest with a really small group of surviving fighters. This is when the Dutch offered her amnesty, a chance to just surrender and survive, and she completely refused. No way. Instead, right there in the wake of immense, overwhelming grief and immediate danger, the remaining fighters unanimously chose her to take supreme military command. Demonstrating incredible fierce resolve, she actively led her desperate, starving unit for nearly a month through the unforgiving jungle toward the Gayo Highlands. And they weren't just fleeing, you know? They launched surprise strikes on colonial outposts along the way just to capture the weapons and the rations they desperately needed to survive.
And that leads us to Section 4, the final stand, on October 24, 1910.
Cut Mutea and her totally exhausted unit had paused near the banks of the Kruing Puto River. They were just trying to rest for a second, trying to prepare a meager meal, probably thinking they finally had a brief moment to just breathe. But suddenly, right out of the jungle, a detachment of that elite Dutch Corps Marechaussee, led by Lieutenant Mosselman, springs a deadly surprise raid directly onto their riverside position. Absolute chaos erupts. The air is immediately just filled with the deafening sound of gunfire as these heavily armed Dutch forces descend upon the resting, severely under-equipped Achenese fighters.
So the heavily armed Dutch troops are advancing, and they vastly outnumber and outgun the guerrillas. It's not even close. But Cut Mutea, she doesn't cower, and she absolutely does not surrender. She draws her traditional Achinese dagger, or renkong, and she literally charges directly into the gunfire, engaging the advancing soldiers in fierce, hand-to-hand combat. During this unbelievable display of bravery, she's struck by 3 gunshots to her head and chest and falls on the field of battle.
As she lay dying on that battlefield at the age of just 40 years old, she spoke her final words to one of her trusted commanders, Tuku Sheikh Bua. She said, "Save my son, Raja Sabi. I place his life in your hands." It's incredibly moving. Even in her final moments, her entire focus was on the survival of the next generation, making sure her son would live on despite the ultimate sacrifice she had just made.
Let's look at what happened after, in Section 5, an enduring national legacy.
While her death was an undeniable, tragic loss on the banks of that river in 1910, her intense jungle warfare translated into a truly enduring national legacy, 1,000. So why is this specific number important? Well, because today, Cut Nyak Mutea's fierce legacy is quite literally carried in everyday wallets all across Indonesia. Her portrait proudly graces the front side of the 1,000 Indonesian rupiah banknote. Meaning, every single time someone makes a small purchase or pays a bus fare or hands over a bill, they are interacting with the image of a woman who gave absolutely everything for the independence of her homeland.
And that everyday recognition is backed up by the absolute highest honors a nation can bestow. On May 2, 1964, she was officially declared a national hero of Indonesia by President Sukarno. Today, her name is etched into the very infrastructure of the country. From the beautiful historical Cut Mutea Mosque in central Jakarta to countless streets, hospitals, and public institutions nationwide. Cut Nyak Mutea proved, once and for all, that true leadership isn't about the odds you face, it's about the unwavering principles you refuse to abandon. She literally chose a dagger against rifles, rather than surrender her homeland. So the final thought I want to leave you with today is this. When faced with overwhelming pressure to compromise your core values, how far would you be willing to go to defend them? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.